The wind came down off the ridge first, then the rain, and by the time the wagon rolled into Briar Hollow, the road had turned to a ribbon of black mud that sucked at the wheels with every turn. Marguerite Vance sat with her spine straight and her gloved hands folded over a carpet bag that held everything she owned, watching lantern light bleed yellow through the dusk from windows she did not yet know. She had been 3 weeks on the trail from Ohio, and the cold had settled so deep into her bones that she had stopped noticing it, the way a person stops noticing an old ache. The driver, a leathery man named Purdy who chewed tobacco and rarely spoke, finally broke the silence as they crested the last hill before the Echo Ridge spread. "Last chance to turn back, ma'am," he said, not unkindly. "Ashworth boys have run off 2 housekeepers and a schoolteacher this year alone. Folks in town say that ranch eats women whole." "I am not afraid of boys," Marguerite said, though her voice came out thinner than she intended. Purdy only grunted and snapped the reins. The ranch house rose out of the storm, like something carved from the mountain itself, long and low, smoke twisting sideways from the chimney before the wind tore it apart. Even before the wagon stopped, she could hear them. Boys, plural, a chorus of shouting that did not sound like play so much as war. A dog barked. Something crashed. A boy's voice, cracking with the particular fury of adolescence, shouted that it wasn't his turn to feed the hogs and never would be again as long as he lived. She climbed down before Purdy could offer his hand, boots sinking into the mud, and stood looking up at the porch where a man had just appeared in the doorway, with a lantern raised against the dark. He was tall in the way that made door frames look smaller, with shoulders that had clearly spent a lifetime hauling fence posts and hay bales, and a face weathered into permanent watchfulness. His eyes found her and held there, unreadable, the way a man might study weather he didn't trust. "You're the one from the agency," he said. It wasn't a question. Marguerite Vance. She did not extend her hand, sensing somehow that he wouldn't take it. "I was told there was a position." There was, still might be, depending. He stepped back from the door, and the lamplight caught the grey threading early through his dark hair, the small crease between his brows that looked permanent. "Name's Caleb Ashworth. You'll want to come in before you catch your death." Inside, the chaos resolved into 6 boys, ranging from a gangly youth, nearly as tall as his father, down to a small one, barely past the toddling years, all frozen mid-skirmish around an overturned chair and a spilled pail of milk that was spreading across the floorboards in a pale lake. They stared at her with the particular suspicion children reserve for anything that threatens to change the order of things. "This is Tobias," Caleb said, nodding to the eldest, 16 and sullen, arms crossed. "Eli, Sawyer, the twins, Jonas and Micah, and Wyatt." The youngest, perhaps 5, peered out from behind his father's leg with wide eyes and a thumb hovering near his mouth before he caught himself and dropped it, embarrassed. "Boys," Caleb said, "this is Mrs. Vance." "She won't last," Tobias said flatly, and turned and walked out of the room. Marguerite looked at the milk spreading toward her boots, at the 5 remaining boys watching her with the wariness of creatures who had learned that adults who arrived with suitcases tended to leave with them not long after, and she set her carpetbag down on the one dry patch of floor she could find. "Well," she said, "someone had better find me a rag before this reaches the hearth." It was not affection that moved Eli, age 14, to fetch one. It was, she would later understand, simple curiosity. She had not yelled, had not wept, had not looked at his father with the silent appeal for help that the others had worn down to nothing. She knelt right there in her traveling dress and mopped the milk herself, and the boys watched her do it the way they might watch weather change. The first weeks tested her in ways the agency in Cheyenne had not prepared her for. Someone put a garter snake in the flour bin. Someone, she suspected the twins, who shared a single unreadable look between them like a private language, greased the porch steps so she went down hard on her hip, though she said nothing of the bruise to anyone. Sawyer, 12, refused to speak to her at all for the better part of a month, communicating only through pointed silences and the occasional slammed door. She did not punish, did not plead. She simply kept rising before dawn to start the stove, kept mending the boys' shirts with neat, even stitches, long after they'd gone to bed, kept setting 6 places at the table, even on the nights when only 5 boys appeared to eat. Caleb watched all of it from a careful distance, the way a man watches a fence line he expects to fail. He had buried his wife 4 winters past, after a fever took her in the space of 9 terrible days, and in the time since he had built a particular kind of armor, not unkind, never unkind, but guarded in the manner of a door that had been slammed shut once too hard to ever swing freely again. He spoke to Marguerite only of practical matters. The wood needed splitting. The well water had turned brackish after the last rain. Wyatt's boots were nearly through at the soles. "You don't have to manage them alone," he told her one evening, the only time in those first weeks he lingered in the kitchen after supper instead of retreating to the barn. "Tobias is hard. He took his mother's passing harder than the rest. I don't expect you to fix that." "I don't intend to fix him," Marguerite said, not looking up from the shirt in her lap. "I intend to outlast him." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Caleb's face before he caught it and went still again, as though smiling were a debt he wasn't sure he could afford to pay. It was Wyatt who came to her first, in the quiet way the youngest often do. He took to following her through her chores, small and solemn, handing her clothespins at the wash line, naming the chickens after generals he'd heard about from Tobias. One evening, after a nightmare sent him stumbling from his bed, it was Marguerite's door he knocked on, rather than his father's, and she sat with him by lamplight until his breathing evened, humming something low and wordless that she remembered her own mother humming, decades and a continent away. The twins came around through mischief turned to mutual conspiracy. She caught them trying to teach a barn cat to fetch and, instead of scolding, knelt down and showed them how she'd once trained a dog back home, until the 3 of them were laughing in the hayloft while the cat sat utterly unmoved by all their efforts. Sawyer's silence broke the day she noticed, without him saying a word, that he'd been quietly teaching himself to read from an old almanac, because he was ashamed to ask, and she began leaving easier books on his pillow without comment, never once mentioning what she knew. Eli warmed steadily, helping her haul water, teaching her the names of the mountains visible from the eastern pasture. Only Tobias remained a held breath, watching her with his arms crossed and his jaw set, waiting, she understood, for the moment she would prove herself just like the others, temporary, removable, gone. Autumn deepened into the kind of cold that turned breath to fog and frosted the windows by morning. Caleb grew quieter as the season changed, the particular silence of a man counting his herd against the coming winter and finding the numbers tight. Marguerite learned to read the weather in his shoulders before he said a word about it. She began stretching the stores further than they were meant to go, without being asked, without making it a matter of conversation. Fewer eggs cracked into the morning batter, broth made to last 2 meals instead of 1, and somehow the boys never went hungry, and Caleb never had to say the words that would have cost him something to speak aloud. The storm came in November, faster than the sky had promised. It started as rain and turned to ice within an hour, and by the time Caleb realized the cattle in the north pasture hadn't been moved to shelter, the temperature had dropped hard enough to kill a man caught out in shirt sleeves. Tobias and Eli were already saddling horses before he'd finished pulling on his coat. "I'm coming," Marguerite said, already wrapping a scarf twice around her throat. "You'll freeze," Caleb said. "So will you, standing here arguing about it." He looked at her for one long moment in the lamplight of the barn, rain hammering the roof above them, and something in his face shifted. Not surrender exactly, but a kind of recognition, as though he were seeing the shape of her for the first time, and finding it sturdier than he'd allowed himself to believe. "Stay close to me," he said, and it was not a command so much as something gentler than that. They drove the herd through sheeting ice for nearly 3 hours, Marguerite's hands gone numb on the reins, her skirts frozen stiff against her legs, shouting directions to the boys over the wind, the way she imagined a captain might shout to a crew in a storm at sea. When the last steer was finally pushed into the shelter of the lower barn and the gate dropped shut behind it, she found herself standing in the sudden quiet beside Caleb, both of them soaked through and shaking with cold, and something that wasn't only cold. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Neither did you," she answered. "And yet." He huffed something that was almost a laugh, rare and rough, and for a moment, in the lantern light with ice melting from his lashes, he looked younger than she had ever seen him. Not the careful, guarded rancher who measured every word, but a man simply grateful not to be standing alone in the cold. It was Tobias who found them there. He had hung back from the others, ostensibly checking the gate latch, and he stood now in the barn doorway, watching his father look at Marguerite, the way he hadn't looked at anyone in 4 years. Something in the boy's face cracked open, not anger this time, but a grief so old it had calcified into something else entirely, something almost like relief. "She stayed," he said, to no one in particular, the words barely audible over the wind. "She actually stayed." Marguerite turned. "I told you I would outlast you," she said gently. Tobias studied her a long moment, rain dripping from his hat brim, and then, for the first time since she'd arrived, he nodded, not in defeat, but in something that looked very much like welcome. By the time the storm broke, just before dawn, the sky had cleared to a hard, clean blue, and frost lay sparkling over the whole white world, like something newly made. Marguerite stood on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, watching her breath curl into the cold morning air, when Caleb came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "The boys," he said slowly. "They've taken to you. All 6 of them, finally." "And you?" she asked, before she could stop herself. He was quiet long enough that she thought she'd overstepped, but when she glanced at him, his eyes were steady on hers, none of the old guardedness left in them now. "I think," he said, "I stopped fighting it somewhere around the time you climbed into that ice storm after my cattle without being asked." He reached over, hesitant, and took her cold hand in his rough, warm one. "I'm not an easy man to love, Marguerite. I've got 6 sons and a mountain of grief, and a ranch that'll work you to the bone." "I never asked for easy," she said. Inside, she could hear the boys stirring, Wyatt's small voice asking where she'd gone, the twins arguing good-naturedly over breakfast chores, Sawyer's quiet laugh, Eli's steady footsteps on the stairs. Even Tobias's voice rose among them now, lighter than she'd ever heard it. Caleb looked toward the sound of his sons, then back at her, and something settled in his face, like a long winter finally giving way to spring. "Stay," he said simply. "Not as the housekeeper, stay as family." The sun broke fully over Echo Ridge then, gold spilling across the frosted pasture, catching in the ice-laden branches of the cottonwoods, until the whole ranch seemed to shimmer like something out of a dream half remembered. Marguerite Vance stood on that porch with her hand in his, 6 boys' voices rising warm behind the door, and understood that she had not simply found a position, nor even a family, but a home, earned slowly, through silence and patience and one impossible storm, the way the truest things on the frontier always were.